At the rear of the National Museum of Scotland, on the outside wall of the lecture theatre, there is a plaque. On this site, Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, author of The Origin of Species, lodged at 11 Lothian Street while studying medicine at the University of Edinburgh, 1825 to 1827. This is a talk about that short but influential time in Darwin's life. Darwin was not then the eminent scientist with an Old Testament beard, but would have looked more like this portrait of him by George Richmond, done in 1839 at the time of his marriage. He was 30 when this portrait was done, but he arrived in Edinburgh when he was half that age, 16. He would have been ganglia and possibly spotty. Darwin came from a wealthy family with connections to entrepreneurs, religious nonconformity, free thinking, and, in particular, anti-slavery. Charles Darwin was the grandson of Erasmus Darwin, physician and polymath and member of the Lunar Society, a learned society of industrialists, natural philosophers, and intellectuals who met in the English Midlands in the 1770s and 1780s. As well as Erasmus Darwin, members included Matthew Boulton, Joseph Priestley, James Watt, and Josiah Wedgwood. Erasmus was the author of Zoonomia, a study of the functioning of the body, which included a postulation that all life was descended from a common ancestor. Erasmus Darwin's second son, Charles, came to Edinburgh to study medicine, but died when a student in 1778, apparently from an infection acquired through a cut sustained while performing an autopsy. He is buried in Buccleuch Parish Burying Ground on Chapel Street. A third son, Robert, was Charles Darwin's father. Darwin's maternal grandfather was Josiah Wedgwood, potter, inventor, and entrepreneur. Wedgwood created and distributed the anti-slavery plaque, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This he did not sell, but gave away to promote the anti-slavery campaign. Josiah Wedgwood's daughter, Susanna, married Erasmus Darwin's son, Robert. Incidentally, in 1839, Charles also married a Wedgwood, Emma, the daughter of his mother's brother, Josiah Wedgwood II. The parents of Elizabeth Allen, mother of Emma Wedgwood, were also cousins. Darwin was aware that his family was dangerously inbred. Robert Darwin was a medical doctor who had studied in Edinburgh. He established himself in Shrewsbury, where he invested in property and in canals and roads. He stopped weighing himself when he got to 22 stone. On house calls, he would send his coachman into a house first to ensure the floors were up to his weight. Charles, the second son of Robert and Susanna, was born in 1809. Here he is with his sister Catherine, painted when he was 6 by Ellen Sharples. Darwin attended school in Shrewsbury, but was a lacklustre pupil. He exasperated his father by being more fond of field sports than his books. "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." Age 16, Charles was sent to join his elder brother, Erasmus Alvey Darwin, at the University of Edinburgh to study medicine. Erasmus Alvey had studied medicine at Cambridge, but needed clinical experience, not available at Cambridge, to obtain his degree. Edinburgh in the 1820s was a city of the Scottish Enlightenment. In 1826, its population was 150,000, less than a third of the population today, but all within the Old Town, New Town, and South Side. The intellectual life of the city led to it being called the Athens of the North. This appellation of Edinburgh as the Athens of the North came before the Athenian buildings of Calton Hill were built. In 1825, as seen in this painting by Alexander Naismith, the Nelson Monument had been built on Calton Hill, but not yet the monuments to Dugald Stewart or Burns, both 1831, or the National Monument, which was started in 1826, and the Royal Institution on the Mound had just started being built. Construction of Thomas Hamilton's Royal High School began in 1826, a year after Darwin arrived. It would not be finished until 1829, but it appeared complete in the frontispiece of Darwin's Almanac for 1826. Intellectual life in Edinburgh was influenced by such past luminaries as David Hume, the philosophy of skepticism and empiricism, Adam Smith, theories of society and economics, Joseph Black, discoveries through experimentation of carbon dioxide, latent heat, and specific heat, and James Hutton, deep geological time. John Kay's 1787 caricature shows Hutton's theories of deep time chipping away at supporters of geological orthodoxy. All these ideas, particularly geology, were still being debated in Edinburgh in the 1820s when Darwin arrived to study medicine at the university. Edinburgh also had an unrivaled reputation as a centre of medical education. The Royal College of Surgeons had been founded in 1505, the Royal College of Physicians in 1681, and the University Medical School in 1726. Edinburgh offered its students studies in all branches of science, not just medicine, with the most extensive selection of courses of any university in Britain. The university's Natural History Museum was renowned. The collection later formed the basis of the Natural History collection of the National Museum of Scotland. In the 1820s, the collection was continually augmented with specimens from around the world, especially skulls, as Edinburgh was at the forefront of phrenology and in its debunking. The University of Edinburgh had developed a two-tier model for teaching medicine. The two-tiered education model allowed a great number of students to study, but only a few to graduate as medical practitioners. In 1825, only 20% of Edinburgh medical students graduated with an MD. The majority of students attended Edinburgh with the intention of learning natural philosophy for 1 or 2 years. So Darwin, who did not graduate, was the norm, not an exception. In anatomy, the Munro dynasty reigned. Grandfather Alexander Munro Primus was a skilled anatomist, and his notes were the basis of the course for succeeding generations. His son, Alexander Munro Secundus, was also skilled and, with John Lizars, produced accurate and artistic engravings of human anatomy. Alexander Munro Secundus donated his anatomical preparations and those of his father to the Department of Anatomy, where they are still in the University Anatomy Museum. Alexander Munro Tertius followed his grandfather and father into medicine, and by the 1820s has succeeded his father as Professor of Anatomy. He was an unskilled anatomist who did not compare with his brilliant father or grandfather. Alexander Munro Tertius also taught surgery, though he had never trained or practiced as a surgeon. Charles Darwin attended his lectures in anatomy and surgery. His admission ticket survives. Out with the university, there were other schools of anatomy and surgery. Surgeons' Hall was then in Surgeons' Square, close to High School Yards. The present-day Surgeons' Hall did not open until 1832. There were several anatomy schools located in Surgeons' Square. The most popular was Barclay's, where anatomy was taught by Dr. Robert Knox. Knox was an expert in comparative anatomy as well as surgical anatomy. The Knox School had 504 students in 1827 to 28, of whom 247 students were enrolled in Knox's anatomy class. In comparison, Munro Tertius at the university had just 88 students. Students included Robert Owen of dinosaur fame, James Young Simpson of chloroform fame, and probably Charles Darwin. The teaching of anatomy, crucial in the study of surgery, required a sufficient supply of fresh corpses. Darwin's time in Edinburgh coincided with the height of illegal exhumation of burials known as body snatching, though the murderous careers of Burke and Hare did not begin until November 1827, after Darwin had left. The university was not implicated in the scandal, but it did have a separate entrance from North College Street, where Chambers Street is now, for the convenience of certain persons absolutely necessary for the carrying on of a course of anatomy, for they dare not come to the front door. Darwin arrived in Edinburgh on the 22nd of October 1825. He and his brother lodged in 11 Lothian Street. He described his lodgings in a letter to his father. "We got into our lodgings yesterday evening, which are very comfortable and near the college. Our landlady, by name Mrs. Mackay, is a nice clean old body, and exceedingly civil and attentive. She lives in 11 Lothian Street, Edinburgh, and only 4 flights of stairs from the ground floor, which is very moderate to some other lodgings that we were nearly taking. The terms are £1 6 for 2 very nice and light bedrooms and a nice sitting room. By the way, light bedrooms are very scarce articles in Edinburgh, since most of them are little holes in which there is neither air nor light." We set out and walked all about the town, which we admire excessively. Indeed, Bridge Street is the most extraordinary thing I ever saw, when instead of a fine river, we saw a stream of people. All the Scotsmen are so civil and attentive that it is enough to make an Englishman ashamed of himself. We have just been to church and heard a sermon of only 20 minutes. I expected from Sir Walter Scott's account a soul-cutting discourse of 2 hours and a half. The University of Edinburgh had been founded in 1583. A new building for the university had been designed by Robert Adam. Building started in 1790, but work stopped in 1793 due to war with the French. The front was completed, as was the anatomy theatre in the northwest corner, showing the importance to the teaching of medicine. The south and west sections, redesigned by William Playfair, were completed in 1824, though the main library was not finished until 1828. In 1825, the university library was housed in the cracked and crumbling old library, which stood in the middle of the quad. It was so decrepit that one of the first uses of the new building was to prop up the old library. The Anatomical Museum was in what is now the Talbot Rice Gallery, and housed the comparative anatomy collection of Alexander Munro Primus and Secundus, donated by Alexander Munro Secundus in 1798. Darwin had a desk near the stairs to the museum. Darwin had no time for Alexander Munro Tertius, as he described in a letter to his sister Caroline. I dislike his lectures so much that I cannot speak with decency about them. He is so dirty in person and actions. And in his autobiography he wrote, Dr. Munro made his lectures on human anatomy as dull as he was himself, and the subject disgusted me. It has proved one of the greatest evils in my life that I was not urged to practice dissection, for I should soon have got over my disgust, and the practice would have been invaluable for all my future work. This has been an irredeemable evil, as well as my incapacity to draw. Nor did he have much time for Professor Andrew Duncan. Dr. Duncan is so very learned that his wisdom has left no room for his sense, and he lectures which cannot be translated into any word expressive enough of its stupidity. Or Andrew Duncan's topic. I shall ever hate the name of materia medica. Dr. Duncan's lectures at 8 o'clock on a winter's morning are something fearful to remember. A whole cold, breakfastless hour on the properties of rhubarb. While Darwin continued to attend the lectures, however dull, he stopped attending operations held in the Royal Infirmary, then in Infirmary Street. The operating theatre was on the top floor where the light was better. I attended on 2 occasions the operating theatre in the hospital at Edinburgh and saw 2 very bad operations, one on a child, but I rushed away before they were completed. Nor did I ever attend again, for hardly any inducement would have been strong enough to make me do so, this being long before the blessed days of chloroform. The 2 cases fairly haunted me for many a long year. In Darwin's time, Robert Jameson was Regius Professor of Natural History at the University of Edinburgh. In his second year, Charles attended his lectures on geology and zoology, but found them incredibly dull. The sole effect they produced on me was a determination, never as long as I lived, to read a book on geology or in any way to study the science. However, Jameson was also notable for his collection of minerals and fossils. Now in the University Museum, this was one of the largest in Europe and would have been studied by Darwin. Jameson also took his students on field trips, and Darwin would have seen Hutton's section on Salisbury Crags. The only lectures of his medical course Darwin found interesting were those on chemistry, given by Professor Thomas Charles Hope. Dr. Hope has been giving some very good lectures on electricity, etc., and I am very glad I stayed for them. Charles's father despaired of his son. Charles's sister Susan wrote to him in March 1826, My reason for writing so soon is that I have a message from Papa to give to you, which I am afraid you won't like. He desires me to say that he thinks your plan of picking and choosing what lectures you like to attend not at all a good one. And as you cannot have enough information to know what may be of use to you, it is quite necessary for you to bear with a good deal of stupid and dry work. But if you do not discontinue your present indulgent way, your course of study will be utterly useless. Papa was sorry to hear that you thought of coming home before the course of lectures were finished, but hopes you will not do so. Susan also recommended, do go some day to see Roslin Castle, which I believe is within a few miles from Edinburgh, and it is very worth seeing. At present, they have made a diorama of it in London. Remember to write slow, and then you will form each letter distinctly. Certainly, Charles's handwriting is not easy to read. Ah. But Darwin did not waste his time in Edinburgh. Although he found them dull, he did attend the lectures. He spent a lot of time in the university library and museum. From Robert Jameson, he learned about geological strata and the problem of the non-existence of animals. Jameson had translated Essay on the Theory of the Earth by French naturalist and anatomist Georges Cuvier. The skeleton of a giant deer, now in the National Museum of Scotland, was evidence that animals no longer lived in areas that they once populated. In the early 19th century, as scientific exploration progressed, it was becoming more evident that many animals, especially megafauna and the lizard-like animals, later called dinosaurs, no longer lived anywhere on Earth. Extracurricular discussions about geology must have made an impression, as Charles Lyell gave Darwin the first volume of his book, Principles of Geology, which explained for the public the theories of James Hutton. Charles Darwin later said, "He who can read Charles Lyell's grand work on the principles of geology, which the future historian will recognize as having produced a revolution in natural science, yet does not admit how incomprehensibly vast must have been the past periods of time, may at once close this volume." The first volume was published in 1830, just in time for his voyage on the Beagle, and on his return Darwin described himself as a geologist. In 1849, Darwin was asked to write the section on geology for a naval manual, and in 1859 he was awarded the Wollaston Medal, the highest accolade of the Geological Society of London. In Edinburgh, Darwin met many of the preeminent men of the day. He joined learned societies in Edinburgh and met Walter Scott at the Royal Society of Edinburgh. In his second year, Darwin joined the Plinian Society for Student Naturalists. Here he heard papers, amongst others, on the cuckoo, chemical analysis of spar water, oceanic and atmospheric currents, the anatomy of expression, and the uses of vacuum in the natural world. At the Public Venerian Natural History Society, Darwin heard John James Audubon deliver some interesting discourses on the habits of North American birds, and Audubon demonstrate his method of supporting birds with wire. Audubon was in Edinburgh seeking financial support for his monumental Birds of America. This portrait of Audubon in American dress was painted by John Syme in 1826 during Audubon's time in Edinburgh. In his second year, Darwin took lessons in taxidermy from former slave John Edmonston. Edmonston was born into slavery in Guyana. Upon gaining his freedom, he travelled to Scotland and met the naturalist Charles Waterton, who taught him the craft of taxidermy. Edmonston became a tutor at Edinburgh University, where he taught university students the art of taxidermy and preserving natural specimens, charging 1 guinea for an hour every day for 2 months. He lived at 37 Lothian Street, just a few doors down from where Charles Darwin lived. Charles says, "By the way, a Negro lived in Edinburgh who had travelled with Waterton and gained his livelihood by stuffing birds, which he did excellently. He gave me lessons for payment, and I often used to sit with him, for he was a very pleasant and intelligent man." So Darwin not only learned how to preserve biological specimens, he also learned about the flora and fauna of South America. Darwin met Robert Edmund Grant at the Plinian Society. Grant had a medical degree from Edinburgh, but gave up medical practice in favour of marine biology and the zoology of invertebrates, which he taught at Dr. Knox's school. Darwin studied marine invertebrates on the shores of the Forth with Grant. Darwin presented his first scientific paper to the Plinian Society in March 1827. It was on his discovery that black spores, often found on oyster shells, were the eggs of a skate leech. Days before Darwin delivered his paper to the Plinian Society, however, Grant read a similar paper to the Venerian Society and did so without Darwin's knowledge. This led to a cooling of the friendship. Darwin's Edinburgh reading list survives. John Abernethy, John Ayrton Paris, and William Henry are suitable reading for a medical student. Cuvier, Grant, and Brewster reflect Darwin's wider scientific interests and his connection with Edinburgh's intellectual community. There are several books on travel, particularly to the Arctic. Then there was his grandfather's book and a biography of Erasmus Darwin. The rest are lighter reading. Almack's, Granby, and Brambletea Hall House are novels, and the list includes poetry and essays. Darwin left Edinburgh in 1827 without graduating, as was the norm. He went up to Cambridge to get a degree so he could become a clergyman. This was the time of the gentleman naturalist, when holding a living, with a curate doing the parish work, gave time for the study of nature. While at Cambridge, Darwin's tutor, John Henslow, was invited to be a gentleman companion to Captain Robert Fitzroy on a hydrographical voyage aboard HMS Beagle, focusing on South America, the land of John Edmonstone. Henslow was dissuaded from going by his wife, so Henslow recommended the unmarried Darwin. The Beagle sailed in 1831, and the voyage lasted almost 5 years. Following his return from the voyage in 1836, Darwin presented his mammal and bird specimens to the Zoological Society of London. The bird specimens, including the Galapagos finches, were given to John Gould in January 1837. In March, Gould reported that the different characteristics were confined to separate islands. This information helped Darwin formulate his ideas on evolution. In 1837, Darwin jotted down his ideas for evolution through natural selection. I think. To have many species in same genus requires extinction. But knowing it would have quite an impact, he delayed publication. Darwin visited Edinburgh again in 1838. He revisited Salisbury Crags, studying geology, in particular the intrusions described by Hutton. He was in Edinburgh on his way to Glenroy to see the parallel roads, horizontal terraces on either side of Glenroy, once assumed to be man-made, but by Darwin's time thought to be natural. In 1839, Darwin presented a paper to the Royal Society of London on the parallel roads. He proposed that they were sea beaches, his experience of land being uplifted during an earthquake in Chile giving support to the theory, and that he could not find any evidence of any material that could have dammed Glenroy. A year later, Louis Agassiz visited Glenroy. Agassiz was a Swiss-born biologist and geologist. He proposed that Earth had experienced ice ages and that northern Europe had been shaped by glaciers. He wrote a paper showing how the parallel roads of Glenroy could have been formed by a succession of ice dams. Darwin eventually publicly admitted that Agassiz was correct. Being wrong made him extra cautious about publishing on the origin of species. He spent 20 years collecting evidence in support of his theory of evolution. He was finally pushed into publication in 1859 when Alfred Russel Wallace proposed a similar theory in a letter to Darwin. In 1866, less than 10 years after the publication of On the Origin of Species, Darwin was selected to represent biology on the front of the new museum. This bust balances the plaque at the rear of the museum. Darwin would not have become the eminent biologist commemorated here if it had not been for his 2 years in Edinburgh from 1825 to 27. Thank you.